All right, this content has some new stuff to it. This is stuff that I had typically covered towards the end of the year during discussions about domestic foreign policy, economic policy, but we're going to work it into the Congress stuff because there is this terminology in the Congress standards. So, what we really need to know is that the Constitution gives the job of creating the budget to Congress. They're in charge of both raising revenue and spending that money through appropriations. And so the budget process really today is a cooperation between the legislative and executive branches. And mostly that's because of this law here, the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. It simply set up the timeline for the budget process that we know today. And it also created the Congressional Budget Office. They're a nonpartisan organization that's main job is just simply to help Congress with the function of creating the budget. You'll also hear them a lot in the news when Congress is debating major pieces of legislation because their job is to also help to inform Congress on the financial impact of legislation, whether that be on potential revenue for the government, how it will impact the debt. So, things like Obamacare, things like the Trump tax cut, you'll hear the CBO give an independent analysis on what that impact will be. The law also requires the president to spend money that Congress appropriates. Up until that point, it was somewhat common for presidents to impound money that they were allocated. Jefferson was the first to do it. Simply a refusal to spend the money that Congress gave them. Perhaps the congressional funding conflicts with the president's legislative priorities, and so they simply don't spend the money. But because of perceived corruption with the Nixon administration, imagine that, Congress adopted this law that now requires the president to spend that money. So here's the basic idea. Now the president's team, and really through the Office of Management and Budget, it's one of the White House agencies, but it's really the executive branch's responsibility to develop the budget, and then they send that proposal to Congress for them to essentially approve. Basically, the president talks to all the agencies, asks them what their budgetary requests are. The OMB helps to develop that. In any particular budget sent to Congress, you're going to see the president's legislative priorities. If he's not a particular fan of the EPA, you're not going to see a lot of funding requested for that agency. And so the CBO then will get that and then prepare a report for Congress. Step 2 is Congress's job. So they're first going to agree to the idea of the president's budget with a concurrent resolution. President doesn't have to sign this. It's simply a statement that agrees to the ideas set forth in the budget. Then Congress will go about actually passing the law, the appropriations law that will allocate that money to the agencies to actually spend. And so the idea is they're supposed to have this done by the summer, and then the president will sign it. The fiscal year starts in October, and so the true deadline is September 30th. I think only twice in the last decade have we passed a budget through the correct process. There's been a lot of partisanship, obviously, on lots of issues, but the budget is one of those. And so what they'll typically do is pass a continuing resolution to simply fund agencies at the same levels they were the year before. In the mid-90s, we had a government shutdown, meaning they couldn't agree to a budget. And so they just simply stopped. They didn't have the money to continue non-essential services. And that was a huge deal. Like you'll find it in Mr. Hennig's American history textbooks. And then we've had it happen 3 times in the last decade. And so it's become, unfortunately, increasingly common as the partisan divide in Washington extends to just about everything. We've seen government shutdowns because they can't agree to a budget under the requirements legislated, as we discussed before. Here's all the new stuff. Okay, the new stuff includes a lot of vocabulary, but it deals with difficulties in Congress in actually reining in spending. Everybody goes to Congress saying that they're going to do something about the deficit or the debt, say they're gonna cut taxes and whatever. All that's great for campaign speeches, but it's really difficult to do in reality. The biggest reason it's difficult to do is this. 60% of federal spending is mandated by law. It's called mandatory spending. And you see it right in that first bullet point. It's simply spending that is set up by law rather than the yearly appropriations. Okay, so this is stuff like a program that government has created at some point. And so the law says that this is something that has to exist. And so unless Congress changes that law, the spending remains. Okay, this is not the yearly appropriations that Congress distributes all the time. This is mandatory spending set forth by prior laws. And so the biggest of that is what's called entitlement spending. Spending that the law stipulates, here's who qualifies to get it. And if you qualify, you get the money. The biggest one, Social Security. Okay, I think there's this massive misconception that when we talk about entitlement spending, automatically your mind goes to like welfare or food stamps. That is just simply not the case. The biggest portion of our entitlement spending by far is on the elderly. Social Security is about 40% of all mandatory spending. Medicare is next at about a quarter of the spending. Medicaid, which is money for health spending for low-income individuals, is the next biggest at 15%. So those three programs alone, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, that's 80% of the entitlement spending that we have. Okay, now interest on the debt is not technically counted as mandatory spending based on the traditional definitions, but it is something that money has to be allocated for. And so if you lump interest on the debt in with the entitlement spending and other mandatory spending, all of that stuff that has to be spent each year is about 70%. So you're really talking about a pretty small percent of the budget realistically that's left for what is called discretionary spending. Okay, whoops, excuse me. So here's the graph of that. Mandatory spending here, interest on the debt is here. Okay, so again, not something that technically, based on our traditional definitions, counts as mandatory spending, but it is. It is required. This is all that you're left with. 30% can be spent on whatever Congress wants. Okay, of that discretionary spending, of the spending that is up for appropriations on a yearly basis, half of that is defense. So there you go. When you've taken only 30% of the budget and made it eligible to spend how Congress wants, and then you take about half of that and use it on defense, you're left with realistically a pretty small amount of money that's left for other programs. And so when you hear congressmen or when you hear a presidential candidate talking about spending's out of control, and they're not talking about entitlement spending reform, they're not talking about Social Security particularly, then they're full of beans, because there is no way to solve our national debt without tackling entitlement spending. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, those are the big ones. And so what we've had is a pretty routine budget deficit. Okay, deficit and surplus refers to the yearly shortfalls. Okay, I'll say shortfalls because we've only had a surplus since 1960 during the last part of the Clinton years. Okay, Clinton actually had a budget surplus, which might shock you if you hear the traditional rhetoric on Clinton, but that's the last time we've had a budget surplus. We had deficits then, so you've got 9/11 and Iraq War spending and Afghanistan spending since that point, in combination with tax cuts, so that certainly leads to deficit spending. Started to work its way back down, but then the Great Recession of 2007 hit, and so you had huge losses in revenue for the government, and you had massive spending. The Bush administration, you've heard of the bailouts for like the auto industries and the banks. There was tons of federal spending in response to that, and so that drove deficits to new levels. During the Obama years, you started to see that work itself back down. But then towards the tail end again, you've seen deficits rise. Certainly the situation that we're in right now will not help with these projected deficits. So here's where we are right now. But you have massive increases in military spending. You have massive tax cuts. And so those things are cool on paper, but they certainly don't lead to a balanced budget. And so that's where the projections will be over the next half decade. We'll see what happens. This is a look at just the national debt overall. So again, deficit, yearly shortfalls, debt is the accumulative total. Okay, so we see lots of debt as a result of World War II spending, but then that drops pretty quickly. We had, I don't know if to what degree you know this, but in the 50s we had pretty high individual income tax rates, somewhere around the 70%. Tax rates have fallen massively over the years on all sorts of issues. But here's again where we're looking to be. So that really started to creep back up as a result of the recession and the bailout spending, and it's projected to continue to climb. And so again, debt, the total amount, add up all the yearly deficits, that's the national debt. And so, gosh, unless Congress will agree to do something about entitlement spending, and why is entitlement spending going up? I probably should have addressed that. Social Security in particular, it's underfunded based on how many people are drawing off of it. So we either need to see the taxes go up to fund it, or the amount of money that is paid to Social Security beneficiaries go down. The other problem is the retirement age. When you can start to collect Social Security, it was meant to simply, when it was developed, it was meant to simply supplement the last, few years of your life. But as lifespans increase, people are going to draw on it for a much longer period of time, which certainly puts a strain on the program itself. And so Congress is not really looking to make any changes to it, even though they talk about it, because it's politically unpopular. The AARP is a massive lobby. We know old people vote at the largest rates of any age group. And so talking about changing Social Security or Medicare, good luck, because there is universal support by the elderly to oppose any changes to those programs. So that's where Congress and the partisan divide will continue to struggle, getting control of the national debt. Thanks.